It's been amazing. This is my first time in Mexico. I've never been here, so I'm really excited to be here. I wish we had more time, but I'm really happy to meet my readers finally in Mexico, and I hope that I get to see them again. Yeah. I'm honestly not sure about the things like sales numbers or the more technical things. I think my publisher will know better, but I do have to say that I am always hearing from my readers in Mexico and in Latin America. They message me a lot online, and I always really enjoy hearing from them. And I hope that means that the books are having a good reception in Latin America, and I hope I keep getting to write more books for them. Yes, that's a great question. I was a political science major at university, and I thought I was going to become a lawyer, but I'm not very good at being confrontational, so it's probably for the best that I didn't become a lawyer. But I always loved my classes. I always thought it was really interesting the way that we would debate and discuss the very, very intricate and complicated ways that countries around the world are tied to each other, how that informs both our culture and how we treat each other. And a lot of that goes into my books. I find myself constantly interested in what's happening around the world in terms of politics, and a lot of that seeps into my novels as a result. Yeah. How do I go about constructing my female characters? I kind of construct them in the same way that I construct my male characters for the most part. I try to think of them as humans and give them as many flaws as I think a real human would have. I like to think about, in terms of their being female characters, I like to think about their power dynamics in the world that I've put them in. I try to make it so that they are a wide range of female characters. We don't have to always have strong female characters. Females are allowed to be weak. We are allowed to make bad decisions. We don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be physically strong or a warrior to count as a complicated human. So a lot of that goes into the way I construct the characters. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. A lot of my past novels have definitely been dystopian or science fiction, and that's because I find that when my life feels relatively stable and I feel happy, I have the ability to write dark stories. I think they're really interesting, to explore things like power dynamics and how the world has changed. But Stars and Smoke was written during the pandemic when everything was terrible, and all the news was awful, and it felt like we had stepped into a science fiction movie, and writing science fiction and dark dystopian stories no longer felt like an escape for me. So I wanted to write something that was a little bit happier and that gave me joy during a really difficult time. And so that's why Stars and Smoke is much more romance leaning, much less about heavy topics like government control and power dynamics, and more about this story of two very unlikely two young people in very unlikely roles in the world thrust together into this very unlikely romance, and kind of the chaos that ensues from that. I found that really fun to write, and I hope that was fun to read. Yes, I think it depends on the book. I think that some of my books are appropriate for age 12 and up, such as I think the Legend series, The Kingdom of Back, and so the Legend series and Kingdom of Back, I think, are appropriate for age 12 and up. For some of my other books, like The Young Elites, for Warcross, and for Stars and Smoke and Skyhunter, I think those lean a little bit older. I would feel a little bit more uncomfortable handing them to a 12-year-old because they can be very violent, they can be very dark, and so I would say maybe age 14 and 15 and up for those books. So it kind of depends on the series. Yeah. I was a young reader. I remember when I was 7 or 8, I moved to the U.S. from China when I was 5. So for the first year or two, I didn't know English, and I spent those years learning English. And once I understood enough English, I really loved reading. I would go to the library all the time. I went there every day in the summer, and I would check out just piles and piles of books. Some of my favorites when I was much young, when I was 7 or 8, I really loved reading animal books. Anything with a horse in it, like the Misty of Chincoteague series was one of my favorites. I read the sadder ones too, like where the red fern grows and Sounder, and those were some of my favorites. When I was a little older, In middle school, I pivoted to fantasy and science fiction. So I think the first fantasy novel I ever read was Redwall, the Redwall series by Brian Jakes. I'm sorry, I hope this is okay. The Redwall series by Brian Jakes. That was my first entry into reading fantasy and then later science fiction. And from then on, I was obsessed with that series and basically read nothing but fantasy and science fiction from then on. That's a really great question. I feel like in some ways we are living in a dystopia, a real life dystopia, real life science fiction in some ways. And so I think a lot of young people go through things that are already in these novels. It's not necessarily an escape. But I think what sets science fiction and fantasy apart from the real world is that in science fiction and fantasy, the author is God. Like, you can do anything with these stories, right? So I feel like I have complete control over my characters and my world in a way that gives me a feeling of control over the world. When I was writing Skyhunter, for example, it was during a very dark time in U.S. politics, and this was 2016. And I felt completely powerless as to what was happening in the real world. But I was able to channel that energy and frustration into my fictional worlds and make sure that, the good guys did win and the bad guys did get punished and things could go the way that I wanted them to. And I think that's the power of fiction. I think that is a way to get the satisfaction that you want from the change that you want to see in the world. So I think that in that way, it's very cathartic and comforting, I hope, for young people to read science fiction and fantasy and know that there can be a way out, that usually in these stories, the young people are the way out, from the way they make decisions, from the way they change their worlds. And I think that's what compels me to read science fiction and fantasy, and I hope that that's something that is empowering for young people who are reading it. Oh, thank you so much for the interview and for the wonderful questions. Yeah, I had a wonderful time. Thank you.